I wanted to destroy everything, end it all. How could they do this without my knowledge, without my consent? How could they commit such a heinous sin? How could everyone be so heartless and selfish? How could they hand over Bella to that filthy, despicable man? My mind was exploding. After traveling such a long distance, I arrived only to be greeted by a catastrophe waiting for me. The moment I stepped into the house, the sight before me shook me to my core. My legs felt weak, and the ground beneath me seemed to vanish. The image was burned into my mind, never to be forgotten. Even today, that incident from my childhood remained etched in my memory like an inescapable nightmare. It played in my head like an unending film, pulling me back into the past. I was 10 years old, and my sister was 5 years older than me. As soon as darkness fell, she would dress me in her clothes and put me to sleep in her bed. I enjoyed wearing her clothes, so I would happily drift off to sleep on her cot. But in the middle of the night, I would feel an unsettling touch on my body. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. But one night, things crossed all limits. When I finally saw the face of the person touching me, my mind shattered into 1,000 pieces. It was my sister's very own uncle. I screamed and sat up in shock. He was startled to see me instead of my sister and fled in panic. But it was too late. I had already seen his disgusting face. My heart was pounding violently in my chest. That night, I realized that what I had been feeling for so long wasn't just my imagination. It was real. My sleep was always deep, but I could sense everything even in that state. And tonight, it had gone too far. I was too young to comprehend it completely, but deep down I understood. Why did my sister make me wear her clothes and sleep in her bed every night? Why did that vile man sneak into our room in the dead of night? My innocent mind had matured far too quickly. The next morning, he looked at me with those disgusting eyes, silently threatening me. I gathered my courage and told Bela Baji everything. Her reaction was heartbreaking. She placed her hand over my mouth and whispered, "Rizwan, stay quiet. Someone might hear you." I looked at her in shock. "Bela Baji? Your uncle?" She shushed me again, and a heavy silence fell between us. But the tears rolling down her cheeks and the redness in her eyes spoke volumes. It was clear. She hadn't slept in nights. The fear of that monster haunted her. That day, I learned the truth about Uncle Sheryar's monstrous reality. I wanted to scream, to expose him in front of everyone, to tear off his mask and reveal the disgusting man hiding behind that charming face. But I was terrified of him too. Bela Baji knew no one would believe her. Instead, she would be blamed, humiliated, or worse, beaten into silence. I was just a child, but I understood the sanctity of relationships. It sickened me to think that Sheryar was our uncle, my mother's brother. How could he do such a thing? How could he betray our family like this? I never spoke a word to anyone, because I had promised Bela Baji. But in my heart, my hatred for Uncle Sheryar grew stronger every day. Whenever he came near Bela Baji, whenever he tried to harass her, I would stay by her side. I refused to move even an inch away from her. It was the only way I could protect her. I was just a 10-year-old boy, yet my sister Bella would hold my hand tightly, feeling safe in my presence. I never knew that one day I would leave for a foreign land, and in my absence, our uncle would take advantage of the situation, and just the thought of it sent shivers down my spine. After 5 years, when I was finally returning home, I was filled with excitement. I wanted to surprise my family, so I hadn't informed anyone about my arrival. I took a taxi from the airport and headed straight home. However, as soon as the taxi stopped outside my house, I was taken aback. The entire house was decorated with glowing lights, and a tent was set up outside. It looked as if a wedding was taking place. But whose wedding could it be? How could they arrange such a big event without informing me? For a moment, I thought I had come to the wrong house. Perhaps, after so many years, I had forgotten the way. But as I looked closer, I realized this was my home. I hadn't forgotten my house or the streets I grew up in. As I stepped inside, I saw my family members standing around, but their expressions weren't filled with joy. Instead, there was shock, fear, and a strange unease in their eyes. I placed my bag down and walked towards my mother. She hugged me, but I could sense she wasn't as excited and happy as she should have been. I had expected them to be overjoyed, to embrace me with love and excitement, but their reaction was the complete opposite. It felt as though my presence had unsettled them. Slowly, everyone started gathering around me. Greetings were exchanged, but I could feel an unusual tension in the air. I finally turned to my mother and asked, "Ami, what's this function about? Whose wedding is it?" The moment I asked the question, silence engulfed the room. It felt like everyone had been struck dumb. Just then, my cousin's little daughter chirped innocently, "It's Bella Baji's wedding." I froze in shock. My gaze shot towards my mother. Bella's wedding? With whom? Before I could even finish my sentence, my eyes fell on a man entering the house. He was dressed as a groom, adorned with garlands of flowers and money. I didn't need to ask any more questions. One look at that wretched man and everything became clear. Seeing him made my blood boil. I shot him a look of pure hatred and then turned my furious gaze to my family. My mother, my brother Shoaib, my sister-in-law, they all looked terrified. "This wedding will not happen," I shouted. My elder brother Shoaib stepped forward, trying to calm me down. "What are you saying, Irtaza? The wedding procession is at our door." "Then send them back," I roared, grabbing a glass from the table and smashing it onto the ground. The shattered glass scattered across the courtyard, reflecting my own broken existence. Without wasting another second, I ran upstairs. "Where is Bella?" I could tell that someone had already informed her about my arrival. Standing at her room's doorway, dressed as a bride, tears streamed down her face. The moment she saw me, she burst into uncontrollable sobs and threw herself into my arms. My heart ached. I wanted to hold a courtroom right there and put my entire family on trial for what they were about to do. I wasn't going to let this happen. Not now. Not ever. I grabbed Bella's hand and pulled her downstairs with me. Everyone stared in shock as I led my trembling sister down the stairs. Shoaib stepped forward angrily. "Irtaza, what kind of drama is this? Bella, go back upstairs. The cleric will be here any moment." Bella flinched. I knew how much she feared Shoaib, but this time, I wasn't going to back down. "Bella will not go anywhere. The wedding procession must leave. If not, I will take Bella with me," I declared with unwavering determination. I knew the wedding wouldn't be called off that easily. They would try everything to force me into submission. Without waiting, I firmly held Bella's hand and dragged her toward the exit. Behind me, that vile man screamed and cursed, but I refused to engage with him. The hatred I had nurtured since childhood had now matured alongside me. There was no one in this world I despised more than my uncle. I had never seen a more depraved man in my life. I had always heard the saying that even a witch spares her own home, but my uncle had no shame. He had targeted his own sister's household. Even today, when I recall those memories, I shudder. I was helpless back then, but my heart longed to grow up quickly and protect my sister. Bella might have been my stepsister, but she was my father's daughter, and that bond made her my sister in every sense. My father was weak, but I was not. My name is Irtaza. From a young age, I was sharp and observant. In our large household, I was closest to Bella. She was my father's daughter from his first marriage. My father's first wife had been forced into marriage with him despite loving someone else. She conceived Bella within the first month of marriage, but fled with her lover soon after giving birth, abandoning her newborn without a second thought. For my father, it was an unbearable humiliation. He couldn't face anyone and lived in a constant state of anger and bitterness. He couldn't even bring himself to look at Bella. Bella was raised by our grandmother, who later arranged my father's second marriage to my mother. When my mother arrived in our home, she brought her younger brother along, my uncle, Shahryar, who was deeply attached to her. My mother had no interest in Bella either. If her own father didn't acknowledge her, why should she pretend to care? She was too busy with household chores and raising her own children. Meanwhile, Bella, with her tiny hands, did all the work and looked after the younger siblings. Uncle Shahryar frequently visited our house. In the beginning, I didn't know that Bella was not our biological sister. Our grandmother had concealed this truth from us, but after her passing, my mother would often remind Bella of her mother's betrayal. "You know your mother ran away with her lover, right?" she would taunt. Bella would listen silently, absorbing every harsh word with a quiet resilience. Despite everything, I was always close to her. I cared for Bella deeply. At the time, my uncle Shahryar was a young man in his 20s. Bella was 5 years older than me. When I turned 10, every night at dusk, she would dress me in her clothes and put me to sleep in her bed. I enjoyed wearing girls' clothes, so I would happily drift off in her place. But at night, I would feel an uneasy touch on my body. Initially, I dismissed it as my imagination, until one night, when all boundaries were crossed. I opened my eyes and saw the face of the perpetrator, our own uncle. I screamed in terror, and he fled in panic upon realizing I was in Bella's place. My heart pounded violently in my chest. That night, I understood that the feeling I had sensed every night wasn't my imagination. It was real. My deep sleep couldn't shield me from what was happening, and tonight, I had proof. The next day, I confronted Bella, asking, "Bella Baji, was that really your uncle?" She lowered her gaze and said, "He's your uncle, not mine." Her words struck me like a dagger. She placed her trembling hand over my mouth, silencing me. But the tears streaming down her face and the redness in her eyes were proof enough. Fear of our uncle had robbed her of sleep for years. That day, I realized Uncle Shahryar was not Bella's uncle. He was only ours. Now I understood why Bella made me sleep in her place, and why she would lock herself inside the hot, suffocating room, sleeping on the floor instead of the bed. My parents and the rest of the family would fall into a deep slumber early in the night, unaware of anything. Uncle Shahryar, whenever he visited, would sleep on the rooftop with my elder brother Shoaib. But I knew the truth now, and I swore to never let him hurt Bella again. In the dead of the night, when everyone in the house was sound asleep, Uncle Shahryar would sneak downstairs to harass Bella Baji. After that horrifying incident, I began to notice how he constantly hovered around Bella. He was a vile and wayward man, yet no one ever questioned his behavior. He had once been married, but due to his depraved habits, his wife's family took her back and forced him to divorce her. Now, he had even started indulging in drugs, and no one was willing to give their daughter to him. But his eyes were set on Bella. He knew very well that my mother controlled the household, and that she would never refuse her dear brother anything. But as long as my father was alive, he wouldn't allow such a thing to happen. My father, like me, never liked Shahryar much, but he was helpless before his wife. When my father fell seriously ill and became paralyzed, losing the ability to speak properly, Bella took care of him like a devoted daughter. Her constant care softened his heart towards her. Now that Bella had grown up, even my father couldn't ignore Uncle Shahryar's vile intentions anymore. He confronted my mother and said, "Tell Shahryar to stay away from our house. My daughter is grown now, and I don't like his frequent visits." My mother's response was nothing but anger. Instead of taking the warning seriously, she scolded Bella. "Did you complain to your father about Shahryar?" Father, feeling guilty, fell silent. He was now completely at the mercy of my mother and brothers. Before his illness, he had never once asked Bella if she needed anything or even placed a loving hand on her head. But now, confined to his bed, he finally realized Bella's worth. My other sisters, Sania and Tanya, wouldn't even offer him a glass of water, but Bela was always by his side, taking care of everything. Eventually, my father's heart melted, and he began to show affection to Bela. She, too, felt happiness, even if it came late. By then, I had grown up, and Uncle Sheryar's visits had significantly reduced, because he knew I didn't like his presence in our house. He would only come over when I wasn't home. My mother often complained, "Irtaza, because of you, Sheryar doesn't come home anymore. He says your son doesn't like me visiting." I would remain silent, not bothering to argue, but the truth was that I didn't like him being anywhere near our home. It wasn't just about Bela anymore. I didn't even feel comfortable with him talking to my sisters, Sania and Tanya. Uncle had lost all sense of morality due to his addiction, and he had no respect for familial boundaries anymore. One day, my mother dropped a bombshell. Sheryar wants to marry Bela. Hearing this, I lost my mind. "This will never happen," I shouted. "Make your brother understand that he should never even mention my sister's name with his filthy mouth. I will never let this disgusting man marry Bela." I was enraged beyond control. My mother retorted coldly, "And who do you think will marry your sister? Where will you find the dowry? Be grateful that my brother is willing to marry her without asking for anything." The root of every disagreement between my mother and me had always been Uncle Sheryar. I clenched my fists and replied firmly, "I will provide for Bela's dowry myself. I will arrange her marriage. I beg you all to leave her alone." My father looked at me with gratitude in his tired eyes. Whenever I sat by his side, he would struggle to speak in his broken voice, telling me to take care of Bela and protect her. I decided to take matters into my own hands. I sought help from my friends, saved whatever money I could, and made up my mind to leave for Dubai. I knew that staying here wouldn't change our circumstances, but working abroad might. On the day of my departure, I gathered everyone in the house and said, "Bela is my responsibility. She is my trust with all of you." I hoped they would protect her in my absence. Little did I know what awaited me upon my return. Bela Baji hugged me tightly, sobbing uncontrollably. She loved me dearly, and had been terribly sad since I left. I worked tirelessly in Dubai, doing small jobs to earn money. I endured a lot of hardships, but I never wavered from my goal. A year passed quickly. With time, I made many friends and established connections. Eventually, I found a stable job that allowed me to regularly send money back home. I always sent a separate amount for Bela Baji, even though I knew my mother probably never gave it to her. But I comforted myself with the thought that I was trying my best. Whenever I called home, I would inquire about Bela in detail and talk to her to assure her that I hadn't forgotten her. Time flew by, and before I knew it, 5 years had passed. My mother often told me over the phone about the improvements made to our house with the money I sent, the new paint, repairs, and furnishings. As I was preparing to return home, I decided to surprise everyone. I wanted to see their joy when I arrived unexpectedly. However, my heart was heavy with sorrow because my father had passed away 3 months ago. I couldn't even attend his last rites. After his death, I was even more worried about Bela. When I arrived home and saw the decorations, I was taken aback. The house was adorned with lights and looked like a wedding was taking place. As soon as I stepped inside, everyone's faces turned pale. Instead of the happiness I had expected, I was met with nervous and guilty expressions. Their unusual demeanor filled me with unease. It didn't take long for the truth to reveal itself. When I learned that Bela's wedding was being arranged with that vile man, Sheryar, I felt an uncontrollable rage. I wanted to destroy everything. Everyone knew how much I despised Uncle Sheryar, and they also knew the reason. His disgusting deeds were no secret. Yet, money had silenced them all. Every time Uncle Sheryar visited, he brought expensive gifts, and everyone conveniently turned a blind eye. But I wasn't someone who could be bought with money. I valued relationships over wealth. When I moved to Dubai and started sending money home, everyone obeyed me. It's true. Money holds power. With money, respect and obedience followed. But now, with my absence, they had once again tried to take advantage of the situation. Perhaps it was my father who had been Bella's shield all these years. Even though he was confined to a wheelchair, his presence was a deterrent. But after his death, my mother and brother Shoaib must have thought, with me being abroad, there was no one to stop them. Uncle Shahryar had surely offered them something in return for Bella's hand. Had I not arrived in time, the unimaginable would have happened, and I would never have forgiven myself. I took Bella straight to my close friend Saif's house and told him everything. Saif, being the kind-hearted friend he was, welcomed us with open arms. His mother, a wonderful woman, treated me like her own son. She gently suggested, "Son, if you want, I can look for a good match for Bella. I know many decent families." I replied eagerly, "Yes, please find someone soon. I don't trust Shahryar. He is a despicable man and will definitely try to take revenge on me." Saif insisted that we stay at his house, but I didn't want to burden them. I rented a small 2-room apartment and moved in with Bella Baji. She remained terrified all the time, constantly telling me, "Irtaza, why did you put yourself in danger because of me? That vile man won't hesitate to harm you. You should have left me to my fate." But how could I? Bella wasn't just my sister. She was my responsibility, my family, and I was ready to face anything to protect her. I had prepared myself completely to end my life. I would never marry the man who had harassed me from my childhood to my youth. I could never sleep peacefully out of fear of him. Even if I did, he would haunt me in my dreams. I would rather die than fulfill his vile desires by marrying him. Bella Baji was sobbing uncontrollably, pouring out her heart. I felt immense pain for her. Despite being around 30 years old, she still looked like she was in her early 20s. She was exceptionally beautiful, sharp features, fair complexion, making her stand out. I had heard that Bella Baji's mother was also very beautiful, and she had inherited her looks. Compared to her, my sisters, Tanya and Sania, were quite plain. Every time a proposal came for Bella Baji, my mother would start narrating the story of her mother's betrayal, and the potential suitors would never return. Perhaps this was exactly what my mother wanted, ensuring that Bella's marriage would only happen to Uncle Shahryar. I reassured Bella, telling her nothing would happen to me because her prayers were with me. Although I hadn't returned home, I learned that Uncle Shahryar was searching for me like a madman, intent on harming me. Saif's mother brought a marriage proposal for Bella from her nephew, Major Asim, who was in the army and held a high-ranking position. His first wife had tragically passed away in an accident within a year of their marriage. The proposal was ideal. Saif's family was reputable, and being an army officer, Asim could provide Bella with security and protection from Shahryar. Thus, in a simple ceremony, Bella Baji was married to Major Asim and moved into her new home in the military cantonment, a place with strict security. After ensuring Bella's safety, I finally decided to return home. I needed answers from my mother and Shoaib Bhai. How could they betray my trust? As soon as I entered the house, Shoaib stormed toward me with anger, grabbed my collar and demanded, "Irtaza, where is Bella?" I calmly replied, "She is where she belongs. I have married her off to Major Asim, Saif's cousin." "You can't do this, Irtaza!" Shoaib's voice trembled with rage. I gave my word to Uncle Shahryar. "Do you realize how much disgrace this has brought upon us? The wedding day humiliation? Mamu is furious and looking to kill you." As Shoaib was speaking, my mother entered, her eyes brimming with tears. "My son, you didn't even let me see you properly, and now you're worrying about Bella instead of thinking about your mother?" she said, her voice filled with emotional manipulation. I sighed and replied, "Mother, I missed you too, and I came here especially to see you. But you all didn't keep your promise. You betrayed me. I worked day and night in a foreign land, sacrificing everything to send money home, but all I ever asked for was one thing: to protect Bela. And you failed me. Before we could continue, Uncle Sheryar stormed in with a group of his thuggish friends, each carrying heavy sticks. Without giving me a chance to defend myself, they launched a brutal attack on me. Blows rained down, and I was severely injured, collapsing to the ground in agony. The pain was unbearable, and I soon lost consciousness. They would have killed me had Shoaib not called the police in time. The police arrived and arrested Sheryar and his gang, dragging them away. I remained unconscious for 3 days, fighting between life and death. When I regained consciousness, I found myself in a hospital bed. My head was bandaged, and my entire body ached with unbearable pain. My hands and legs were fractured. I spent an entire month in the hospital, battling both physical pain and the weight of betrayal. Bela visited me every day, sitting by my bedside and weeping uncontrollably. "This is all because of me, Irtaza," she would cry, guilt consuming her. I would comfort her, saying, "Don't blame yourself. Nothing happened because of you. Just as I protect Sania and Tania's honor, I will protect yours too. I could never tolerate anyone's evil gaze falling on my sisters." Over time, even my mother fell silent. She had finally abandoned her blind support for my uncle. At first, this change surprised me, but soon I learned the reason behind it. One day, Tania was wearing Bela's clothes, and my uncle, in his intoxicated state, mistook her for Bela. He grabbed her from behind, causing her to scream in terror. My mother rushed in, only to hear him stammer, "I thought it was Bela." That moment shattered my mother's illusions. She realized that my uncle, in his drunken stupor, could do anything. From that day on, she too disapproved of his presence in our house. However, Shoaib Bhai remained blinded by greed, unwilling to let go of the benefits he received from Uncle Sheryar. With time, everything gradually fell into place. Bela, now settled in her new home, was living a happy life with her husband and children. Every time I saw her smiling and content, my heart swelled with gratitude. Her lips always whispered prayers for me, and perhaps it was the power of her prayers that led to my own success. Today, I stand as a fulfilled man, with a loving wife and children of my own. I have fulfilled all my responsibilities. Whenever I see Bela happy in her home, I feel a sense of peace before my Creator. Respecting relationships is an obligation upon us. People often destroy lives by getting caught up in the differences between step and real relationships, forgetting that we are accountable to Allah for our actions. As for Uncle Sheryar, he met a dreadful end. Even behind the prison bars, he couldn't give up his addiction. One day, he overdosed, sinking into a sleep from which he never woke up. No one ever found out how he managed to obtain drugs in jail, but when we went to receive his dead body, his condition was beyond horrifying. This was the fate he had chosen for himself, a consequence of his own vile deeds.